Good afternoon and welcome to ChaiTime number X. I have no clue how many we've done now, but it's a really interesting topic today. And I'm very excited to introduce two of our panelists. The third one we're joining shortly, I hope. So these are people who I think can really contribute to this topic in sort of different angles, different ways. Both of these, my colleagues here are from the US or in the US right now. Shreefal is from India, but lives in the US, and Hilary lives in the US. So I'll start off by asking my two panelists here to introduce themselves. Hilary, do you want to go first?
Sure, happy to do so. And thank you for the opportunity of being here. I'm very excited for this topic. It's certainly top of mind right now, but I'm Hilary Schultz, CEO and founder of Persephoni BioPartners. And I've been a serial entrepreneur both inside the life science industry and outside. Persephoni is a venture studio private equity hybrid. So we currently have built 5 companies, either by acquiring assets and or bringing on board existing companies and supporting their development. We are investors. And we have many fund partners and additionally building a large fund around our venture studio right now to deploy the next wave and rounds of raising capital for our companies. But very excited and probably will share a little bit more details as the discussion goes forward.
Thanks, Hilary. Shreefal, you want to introduce yourself?
Hi, yes, Shreefal Mehta. I have a PhD in biomedical engineering, MBA. I have done several different companies and startups, mostly as the entrepreneur working on the business side, and mostly all in drug discovery and development. Recently exited a company that had developed a drug in pulmonary hypertension, a novel first in class, and published a book on commercializing biomedical technology and advised several universities, including Stanford StartX Accelerator and Columbia Tech Ventures. Now I have a couple of different startup companies, but I got recently appointed as advisor on a committee to the Department of Biotech, Government of India, which is what is listed in my bio here. So cheers to all of you with a cup of chai, and looking forward to the conversation.
Yeah, I hope you've all got your chai there. I've got my chai here. Hilary, she's got her coffee, I think it is.
I'm a coffee girl.
Is it an Irish coffee? You know, we were at an Irish bar in Boston, so I know, she knows how to, Mahesh, like to introduce yourself?
Absolutely. Thanks so much for having me. Mahesh Narayanan, Managing Partner at Innovation Ventures and CEO of MatchPlay Group. My background has primarily been starting off in academia in neuroscience, and then went into big pharma for a couple of years, primarily in GSK, and led their neuroclinical team before starting a couple of my own ventures. One, a diagnostic company, which was acquired by another big pharma company, and then a cell and gene therapy company that was acquired back in 2020 by another pharma company as well. So kind of been both in the diagnostic space as well as the drug development space. But now I've mostly been on the other side of the table as an investor, and initially part of Innovation Ventures, which is a neurotech fund based in Baltimore, Maryland, focusing on early stage medical devices, diagnostics, and deep tech, focused specifically on brain health. But we also have MatchPlay Group, which is a syndicate of funds that we have developed over the years, and with a focus around deal flow and due diligence, and making it easier for early stage founders as well as investors to be able to go through diligence and get the best out of that investment in the long term. So thank you.
Do you know what, Mahesh, Shreefal, and Hilary? I tell you something. I've had some great people on these ChaiTimes. I've had like many Pangolas, head of R&D at AZ, and many of the greats. But to have 3 like proper entrepreneurs who have done great things and then have got into other things on the back of it. I mean, who have probably been on the ground running companies, small biotechs, and or other things in other industries, and then developing those, investing themselves as well. And we continue to do it, and we haven't. It's a hard market out there, and we're going to discuss some of why we think that might be and how it will turn out. But there's a huge amount of experience, actually on the ground experience in this ChaiTime. So I'm very excited to sort of get this sort of conversation going. I mean, the conversation is going to start around, look, Trump has said, look, drugs are too expensive in America and we need to do something about it. That's where it all started. And he was sort of saying, well, Biden did something with the IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act, but that hasn't really touched the sides of what he really wants to do. So the first question is, really, is Donald Trump wrong to say American drugs are too expensive? From what I've read, they are. And is he right to go after it? So that's an open question just to get the juices flowing and getting a little bit of like, is Donald Trump right or not? And I'll give my opinion at the end. Jump in. So Shreefal, you give your opinion. You've always got to.
Yeah, I'll go into two parts of it. Okay, first is innovative drugs. And the pharma companies very clearly state that 75% of profits from innovative drugs are coming from the US, and 25% from the other countries. US represents a small portion of the overall global market in terms of population. So per capita, the US is definitely paying more and contributing more to the profit margins of these companies for these innovative drugs. But in generics, what's really interesting is that the US ends up paying less on generics drugs because of the way that the market forces are structured over here. The moment you're out of the patent exclusivity, US actually pays less per generic than some other developed countries. So that's an interesting mix there. But clearly, there is a need to consider how we can control drug prices, and the transparency and the lack of it, or rather the lack of it in the US is
I got a message, Shreefal, that some people are struggling to hear you. Just ask a message to the chat. Can everyone hear you? Okay. I think some people can, some people can't. But we'll just come back to that in a minute. So someone can
let me
just see. Maybe you can turn it off or something like that. Just double check. I'm told it's your headphones and your audio is off from someone who knows this sort of thing. Good. Thank you very much. See, it keeps popping up. He's SMSing me. So it's like, he said your headphones are off.
Sure.
Okay. Hilary,
let me try and move to it.
Well, in lieu
are
of
drugs in
saying,
America too expensive? Is Donald Trump right or is he wrong?
well, in lieu of saying convictions if he's right or wrong, this is what I know and highly convicted in, is that drugs are developed not cost effectively. In preclinical advancement or otherwise, like our ethos and how we build our companies is building backwards, right? So looking at downstream manufacturing and how you can usher forward activities to shorten that development timeline. Ergo, leveraging manufacturing facilities that have scale up in GMP earlier than typical for a single standalone company. And the reason being is you're mitigating tech transfer, or those other issues that are nuances or constructs that will delay. Like the statistics are that for every 12 months of delay in preclinical development, you're getting a reduction of 30% in peak sales. And so that has a direct impact both in pricing and the ability of larger end user and buyer of what terms they'll put forth, the pricing nuances, and that kind of conferring on that price point, the distribution, boiling down to the TAMs, SOMs, and SAMs. So my convictions are, if anything, to thwart that off, if it does come to fruition or otherwise, is what can you control, and it's how you're doing and conducting preclinical development and the initial phases of clinical work to shave off cost of development. Oh,
you might be
Thanks, Hilary. So the question to Mahesh is going to extend slightly because I'm going to be a little bit pushy because he invested in America. Well, I think drugs are too expensive in America. I think he's right. They are, and it's quite murky. For this call, I looked into actually how much more expensive, and it's actually very difficult to work out because there's a lot of intermediaries and discounting that goes on between, and they probably are too expensive, and he's right to go after it. And we always knew he would do. And when he campaigned, he said, "I'm going to do this," and then he actually does it. And everyone's like, "I can't believe he's doing that," but he's just doing what he said he was going to do. So let's presume that American drugs are too expensive, and he's right to go after it. How he does that, we always may have another opinion on that. But Mahesh, you invest into US biotechs, traditionally, and you have your own fund that does that. I mean, how can you make it work? It's just too expensive. If you're trying to reduce the pricing, how do you make the returns work for your investors? So how do you see it?
And that's the $1 million or $1 billion question, right? Because I mean, if you look at I think there are two historical data that people have to look at to say that drug prices are expensive. One, over the past, I would say 20 years or so, the focus has been on traditionally drug development areas that are very, very difficult to get drugs into the market. So one is oncology. The second one is neurology. And so oncology has about a 5.5% success rate. Neurology is not too far behind, about 6.7% success rate from clinical one, right? So from phase 1 clinical to commercialization. So those are very low rates just from having human data. But when you are going a little bit further back, I think one thing I would recommend anyone in the call to read is actually a book by Peter Kolchinsky, who's the managing partner at RA Capital, and he has a book called The Great American Drug Deal, which really talks about how prescription pricing works in America, and it goes into very much detail about the innovation side of prescription drugs, not just the mathematical.
We get a moment in between, Mahesh. Put that, just write it on the chat so everyone can see it.
Yeah, absolutely. So,
I finished talking first, but yeah, just
But yeah, it's called The Great American Drug Deal, and you know, one of the main things that I agree with that in the analysis, and I think most investors would as well, is pricing. If it changes in any way in the U.S., it does take away incentive for investors to continue investing in these type of innovations. Now, I'm not saying that it has to be 100x or 200x. I mean, you know, a lot of the reasons why a lot of investors in the space exist is that there is an inherent social economic impact with drug development. You know, people's lives are saved, and so a lot of us do come in from that angle. But at the end of the day, we are getting money from LPs who want to make more money. And so, one major change that if Trump is going after drug pricing, it should be, in my opinion, pharmacy benefit management, which is PBMs. These are the individual organizations between the pharmaceutical company and the payers that, in essence, negotiate prices. And the problem here is that the more they negotiate, the bigger of that discount that they get. And you spoke about discount here. And so this is where the discount pricing comes in. So if a pharma company says the drug is going to be $10,000, and then the PBMs go and negotiate with the payer and say, you know what, I'm going to get it to you for $5,000. They take 10% or 20% of that discount and make that $1,500 to $1,000 out of that deal. However, now if the drug company says, you know what, I'm going to take that same $10,000 drug that we could sell for $5,000, but now the PBMs want a bigger discount and they want a bigger chunk of the pie, so they'll go and say, you know what, increase your drug prices, make it $20,000. I'm going to get $5,000 anyway, right? You're going to get the $5,000 anyway, but we're going to call it $20,000 drug that the payer is now paying for $5,000. It's a $15,000 discount, and now I get to take $5,000 out of back home. Whereas before, it only used to be $1,500 or $2,000, right? And so the drug pricing is actually not as expensive because what the payers in the end pay has been almost exactly the same. It's that discount has continued to increase and increase because the PBMs want to take a bigger chunk of the pie. So you want to bring drug prices down. If you want a $5,000 drug to be $5,000, remove the PBM system out of it and just make the pharmaceutical companies go directly to payers and negotiate prices there and saying, this is how much it costs for us to make, this is how much you pay us. We all make money out of that. But right now, that's not a possibility because these PBMs are there to negotiate prices. And they have to make
part of the system, the machinery, really, of doing this. What you're saying is that there's an intermediary there that doesn't really need to be there. If we could cut that out and make the process more efficient, we'd get better drug prices, and that's maybe
right. So, I don't know if we can really cut that much more prices in drug development, to be honest.
Yeah.
We've gotten very, very efficient. You can throw
We'll come to that. We'll come to that because I think
we'll talk about
there are ways which we discussed.
There are always ways to improve.
Absolutely.
Yeah, but I was at this it was a US India Chamber of Commerce meeting, they called it, in Boston, and there was a lot of VCs there and heads of R&Ds, and the conclusion really was that these drugs are too expensive, and the solution is we need to get better at developing drugs more efficiently, at lower cost, and more quickly. And so we just, as an industry, we have to say, look, you know what, we need to get better. And rather than saying, no, you're wrong, or go after another guy, we say, look, we have to look inwards and say, what can we do better as an industry to develop drugs more efficiently? And I think that's
Yeah, and Sunil, to that point, and to what Mahesh was also saying earlier, and Hilary, getting better at developing. Also, when you have pricing pressure and profit margin pressure, it really brings question about, are you providing enough effectiveness, right? So that whole question around real world evidence, are you having clinical outcomes? In general, we can all agree that drugs provide better clinical outcomes or better patient health and wellness than a similarly priced intervention, let's say a device or hospitalization costs or whatever. So per dollar spent on drugs is actually more effective at improving patient health. So that I think we are all agreed on. The question around new drugs coming up, more expensive drugs coming up, is really, can they justify the price? Well, the most important thing is, let's make sure in the development right from the beginning, you are starting to look more closely for clinical outcomes and being able to enumerate those. And that's becoming relevant. It became, I think it was the nice or not so nice organization out of the UK that really pushed this issue many years ago, looking at effectiveness questions. So that's one aspect of development I just wanted to point out is going to come under more scrutiny.
I mean, when we look at in the UK, we're developing drug. We're filing. It's quite cost effective in the UK to develop a drug compared to other places, even cheaper in India. And we'll discuss again a little bit more. But when we file IP, it's not just for UK and NICE. Otherwise, we'd be bankrupt. We look at, if we can't get into the US market, it's like, let's start again. This is not going to work. We have to be in the US. It is where it's where we make
Yes.
all. And so, the models just do not work without the US. So, and I think Trump is saying you need to be less reliant on us as a country. Like NICE, we don't. On the flip side, we don't get the best drugs in the UK anymore because they're saying, well, the risk benefit is not really worth it. So a lot of people who can afford it will go to other countries for frontline treatment for various cancers and things, because you cannot get those drugs on the NHS or even anywhere. So there has a flip side that you can't get the best medicines here. And when pharma companies are looking to launch, UK is right at the bottom of their list. They don't make money here. They make money in Germany, Japan, and US, and that's probably where they get the bulk of their revenues from. So there is a flip side to it as well. However, the reason I thought Hilary would be great on this. I mean, I recently met Hilary. We were now working together on some things, but her model, and she'd really thought about how to do drug discovery. She doesn't come from our industry initially. She's come from another industry. She's looked at the model and say, well, how can I make this better? And she's really sort of thought about how to do that. So Hilary, maybe you want to talk a little about how your model works and how you think you can improve the cost effectiveness and timelines in developing medicines through what you're doing.
No, thank you. No, I would say, well, in my previous life, I brokered gas and electricity and merchant and banking processing. And the principle kind of an ethos behind building the construct of those previous companies was around, any business is identifying a need, building an apparatus that when you have input, it supplies for that demand. And then the winners are who can provide the efficiency and the improved delta. And that's the lead winner. So I built an organization and a development strategy in those previous companies that have now installed it and implemented it into a venture studio private equity hybrid. And through that, there's certain efficiencies when you build at units at scale, where you can install, an amazing team, the experts, and they can fractionalize throughout a portfolio of companies. So for example, our chief scientific officer, Dr. William Keith, he was the previous group vice president. Eli Lilly was there for 35 years and built the R&D engine that is now in virtue about 80% of the CapEx of Lilly. So across all modalities. So when you have that expertise paired with operators that have scaled multiple programs, you can have that leadership and then steer the initial work for early preclinical companies from discovery or preclinical or mid-stage preclinical assets. One of the things that it has done, and we've proven, across our companies, is we actually cap our SG&A at 20%. As an investor, and I've been an investor in life sciences, both sides of the table, what we're seeing now with the accessibility of capital and stall periods of, early companies being matured or, from round to round, is a lot of non-utility of capital. So SG&A rises above 40%. And what that means for investors is less capital that they do invest is going to actual value creation. So we cap ours at 20% and can subsidize a lot of the fixed overheads throughout our companies. And we're able to do stage gating a capital deployment so that we're not deploying capital when there's not merit. I think in essence, we have a recalibration right now of the marketplace, given the liberty of capital that was there, say 6 years ago, where the bar and measure to receive capital was much lower. Now we've seen that titrate up. And so it's extremely important that biology is validated much earlier so that you can improve the likelihood of efficacy in a first-in-human. That all of those signals are going to bolster up and doing so in a shorter period of time. As I've engaged with many early, call it founders, and you look at their development planning, and we've done this with 4 of our companies that have been onboarded now, we've been able to take a delta and shave off development times, sometimes north of 16 months. And it's when you execute and do things like GMP manufacturing earlier, you can discharge probability or increase probability of technical success and discharge a lot of risk. However, I do not think in those strategies, like early investors are very astute in it. I would say it's more like building akin to large pharma, when you're building at scale and across a portfolio. But I think that is a shapeshifter and something that needs to occur, I know I'm getting a little long-winded. I apologize. I'll drink some chai in a moment and pass the baton. But, in a highly innovative industry, as technology advances so swiftly and quickly, one thing that I noticed, I helped with the global scale of 𝐂𝐡𝐚𝐢𝐓𝐢𝐦𝐞 nonprofit accelerator incubator. And one thing that I saw is that what has not been innovated is how companies are built from inception and on how capital is deployed in early preclinical settings as it relates to ushering and advancing that and accelerating it. And so we're kind of taking that hybrid approach of private equity and venture studio. And so far it's working very well in our favor and also for our companies.
No, we're working with Hilary, and she has a very impressive track record and model and team. And there's some big hitters behind her. And the one thing that we discussed earlier is like her focus is really on small molecules. Small molecules, again, are very, very cost-effective medicines. We know they work very well. And Mahesh said you earlier been in sort of cell and gene therapy space. There's the investments in that area, I think, primarily driven by the cost, I would have thought, but I may be wrong, have kind of softened of late. But a small molecule focus. We're seeing a number of small molecule incubators, and obviously we focus quite a bit on that in o2h, popping up all over the place. And I wonder if it's just cost-driven, experience-driven, or is there something else? Maybe Mahesh, you had a thought on that, given that you've straddled both.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it depends on what component of the small versus large you look at, and that there are benefits and unintended consequences on both sides. With small molecules, majority of the low-hanging fruits have been discovered. So everything else we move forward with are going to be a little bit more complicated. But what we have traditionally seen with small molecules is repeat dosing, which means you're going to need to keep taking it. It's never really curative. It's always, it's very rarely is it prophylactic, but it's almost always going to be a treatment-based, repeated treatment-based approach. Whereas a lot of cell and gene therapies approach has really been curative, and that's always been the battle, is that small molecules up front might look small, but when you look at the life of the patient, it actually adds up to be about the same as large molecule cell and gene therapies. And that's often what the argument is with why is cell and gene therapy so expensive? Expensive? Is it better to have a $200,000 drug that pretty much cures that individual for the rest of the life of that individual? Or do we want to take a $5,000 pill every year for the next 20 years? And you're going to eventually add it to be the same. But what's going to give the better, and this is the unintended consequence of it, what's going to give a better quality of life for the patient, and thus maybe they're more productive from an economic and social perspective, which you don't necessarily see from a small molecule perspective. So if they're always going to be sick for the rest of their life, chronic illness, that's not going to be long-term as economically beneficial for society as someone that's cured. They're 20 years old, they can live the next 60 years of their life, and actually, provide a benefit to the society in some other ways, which has, economic consequences. So there are various things that people look into when we actually come into pricing. It's not just, hey, this is how much it costs us to make, and you pay me this much, and I make a 20% margin. That's often never it's never as simple as that. And so when we look at companies and how we invest in them and how the pricing comes together, we're looking at all these other aspects as well. When are you giving this to the patient? Are you going to give it to them when they're 70 years old? You know what? The economic benefit's not going to be there long term, versus if we can cure a child of cancer when they're 4 or 5 years old. Okay, now they're going to have a long-term benefit economically, so maybe we can charge more at that point. Right.
That's very interesting.
There's a lot of different consequences.
I hadn't thought about that. That's quite.
Yeah, and Mahesh, 20% is not a number that anyone would accept in the industry anyway. So it's usually 60 plus.
These clinical trials are very expensive as well. They're long clinical trials, several hundred million, and whether Pfizer are going to, or whoever are going to buy these drugs, at the multi-billions. And I think that's just sort of maybe is the pushback is from, it starts with Trump, but then it goes to Pfizer or whoever, and then it goes to, we're not going to pay for these trials and we can't afford to spend, the exit value that you require as an investor of 10, 20x or whatever it is. And so that pushback has come into, well, maybe we don't invest in cell and gene. I think there's been a trickle down effect from that, maybe. And but I do get your point in terms of the average price of that drug over a lifetime if you cure it in one shot rather than continuing to take. I think that's a really good point. There's a question in there. I'm going to go to Shreefal in a second in terms of looking at other cost-effective ways of developing drugs and looking at cross-border really, which is o2h is obviously we do that, being Anglo-Indian. Jenny Barnett is a CEO of one of our companies, a great company actually, plug for, which is Monument, one that we've outlined as one of our stars that we'd like to invest into from our growth if we should raise that fund. But her question was really, look, if we cut out the direct consumer advertising and saved all that money, we would bring drug pricing down. I think we're quite shocked in the UK when we come to the US. It's kind of like every other advert is a pharmaceutical advert which gets blasted at you, and it's like, oh, okay, we don't get these in the UK. So there's a lot of that. I had seen some chat that they wanted to reduce or remove that, but I quite enjoy those adverts. I'm just saying myself.
Life is better with our drug.
Yeah. I'm like, I want that. I'm going to call my GP up right away and say, why am I not on that? So I think the direct, so it's obviously a contentious point. So just moving that on is, so look, when I went, Shreefal is an advisor to Indian government on biotech policy and other things. And he has, I was quite amazed with what was, having been in India a long time, I didn't realize the government was so proactive now in trying to develop their ecosystem, and there's a lot going on. So Shreefal, maybe because you have a bit more insight into I don't know if you want to just give us an outline as to.
Yeah, there's a couple of interesting things going on that are relevant. First of all, let me just point out that saying that I'm an advisor to the government on policy may be stretching it a little bit.
I'm allowed to, I'm not regulated.
But I do have a chance to help them with a few things. And one of the reasons I got excited and agreed to join this committee that they asked me to join in was that I saw the Department of Biotech had done some amazing steps to build up an entire ecosystem on biotech entrepreneurship. They have established over 90 incubators, bioincubators, all around the country. They have put money, government money, into a fund of funds that has supported VC groups specifically to invest in companies coming out of those bioincubators. And they now have over 10,000 biotech startup companies, cumulative, of course, so not all of them are alive today, but over 10,000 biotech companies formed that are developed and are developing agri-industrial, diagnostics. It's a combination of those things. But the fact is that they have done a tremendous amount of work. And what's important to understand is that clinical development in India is still faster and cheaper today than going into most other countries and most other areas in developing countries for sure. And one quick example is that of a friend of mine who has a company that took technology from the US, a diagnostic company, and developed that technology with clinical trials in India to get proof of concept in human data. It took him 1/3 the time and 1/5 the cost. And it was the time that was the bigger issue, because in order to recruit patients, get agreements with the universities or hospitals to get access to patient samples over here is a huge hurdle. As we all know, we've negotiated to try to work out clinical trial contracts, for example, and it's much faster. The patient pool is much larger and coming in. So there are some very significant cost and, importantly, time benefits of being able to do early work in development. Your model also, Sunil, of o2h, sitting with a CRO with lower cost overall of development coming from your infrastructure in India is another example of where existing resources. And one last point can be utilized. One last important point is India is known as the pharmacy of the world in some ways, of course, not with the vaccines, which they've already established, but most people don't know that a significant majority of the generic drugs that are bought in the US are all coming out of Indian manufacturing sites. And API delivery and generic drug delivery is a big part of it. That industry will stand to gain if this pricing controls and most favored nation pricing comes down, because it will put more emphasis on getting the generics out into the marketplace, because that's going to be one of the significant cost savings. Right? As I said earlier, when I was reading up for this, it really surprised me. I didn't know, but US citizens pay less per generic drug than anywhere else in the world. Our generics market is one of the most efficient over here, and I was taken by surprise with that.
Thanks for that, Shreefal. I'm going to ask a question about a little bit on because I've been back and forth, and I think it's amazing what the Indian government are doing actually, and it's much needed. And I think we can leverage a lot of capabilities to bring down pricing for the world. I think that's obvious. But one thing is, I've looked around India looking for good startup ideas to invest into and or to support and help. And I keep getting referred to the same two things, which kind of, everyone's now, it's not the poster child. But, when you scratch below that, there's a lot of tech, there's a lot of diagnostics, and, looking for sort of therapeutic startup, great sexy drug target that's well validated and an early program coming out of Bangalore University. They kind of are very thin. I'm not saying they don't exist, because I'm going to get 10 messages saying, here's one. But it's not like the volume.
Sure.
I get inundated every day sitting in Cambridge with a new thing. And I can't cope with actually the volume that I get. A lot of it's very, very early. But do we see that infrastructure building in India, or is there a partnership to
Yeah, there are two parts to it. So one of them is typically the industry for investing in innovative drugs in India has been very, very risk averse, right? They have made so much money with generics. That's their model. That's their playbook that they go by. And so taking the high risk with spending hundreds of millions in clinical trials and waiting for 5 years, that's not their business model. So it's been very difficult to get the switch made. And so what has happened is certain areas have come up. So India first indigenously developed CAR-T therapy is already on the market, for example, at 1/3 the cost than CAR-T therapies here would cost, right? So there are plays that are taking place, but you're right, the volume is not there. The deal flow is not the same. And what is important in that whole playbook, if you look at it, is the pieces are all there to create that kind of revolution that we are seeing out of China right now. For example, innovative molecules popping out of China, mostly in oncology, but the pieces are all there. And so the question is, the risk appetite has not been there from the investors. It is changing. The government on one side of the innovative platform, they have not invested as much in R&D as the rest of the world has. But that's changing. In 2023, they started an initiative to consolidate their intramural research centers, kind of like the NIH intramural research, the BRIC, I forget the full form of biotechnology research and innovation centers. They are consolidating them to create more leveraging and scaling from that. So there are infrastructure pieces that the government is proactively working on and has prioritized biomanufacturing as a major initiative that they are supporting and funding. So there are some things going on that are worth taking advantage of.
Thanks to that. I mean, there's a huge number of incubators appearing. And the other thing that I saw that had these sort of 5 clinical trial centers of excellence, and there's been a huge investment into those clinical trial centers. I think they're probably underused, is what I thought. And so I think there's an opportunity for a business model there which utilizes academic excellence in the UK, US, bridging into India, then bridging back into
I'll just say one other thing about the business models, and this is what Hilary and we were just talking about before we got on the call here, is the virtual model is actually a very efficient and effective model for pharma development. It's kind of like movie development, right? You pick one, the team comes in that does the scripting, and then you have a completely different team that does the filming and the actors, and then that goes away and you get into editing, and then there's a marketing. So biotech development is kind of like that. If you can get the first part of it, the research from, the model has been there for a while, but I'll leave it at that and just say the virtual model is getting more and more traction and more interest. Investors are looking at that and have been looking at that for a while, but it's gaining traction now.
Yeah, no, I think that will bring down the cost of drug discovery. Technology, AI, of course, we all know that's not a discussion for today, but if anyone wants to contribute, they can. But I think, in terms of where the work is done and the access to patients and all these sort of things, this cross-border model will bring down the price of medicines. But, Trump has another policy that he wants everything to be done in the US, and, it's pretty much stated, that tariff-wise, that could rebalance out, but that could actually reverse this sort of globalization of drug discovery and development. And the US is a very expensive place to operate, and forget all the actual cost of executives and infrastructure. But you've also got the insurance and the legal framework, which makes it more complicated and more expensive. So I think that we need to focus on staying global, but so I think he's wrong on that. I hope he's not listening, because I might get, he don't. I'm sure he won't mind me disagreeing with him. But I would agree with him that American drugs are too expensive. That something needs to be done about that. But the solution could be, that post-COVID, we've been more joined up like this than we ever have been before. It forced us into that. So there is a better way of doing things. I'm going to ask the audience if they have any questions, and we can, go through a few of them. I think we've answered the first few. Rupert asked a question here about manufacturing costs of goods. I don't know who wants to take that. Anyone? Acceptable levels of R&D. I don't really.
I could tackle maybe some of the cost of goods manufacturing as it relates to preclinical development and design. One of the things, so like you, Sunil, we get an immense amount of deal flow, and in a high throughput way screen these. And one of the constructs, and certainly with, say, biologics, not small molecules, but in the other spaces, are large molecules, is there's lack of consideration of route of delivery and dose delivery. So, for example, if you need have a necessity of a device, a pen, an injection, an on-body injector, they're not ushering those components or thinking through those. Meaning you can have great preclinical data and for origin of an academic center otherwise, and it works great in an animal. But what is the nuances of adoption in a clinical setting, and how is that going to impact the data package you need to bolster up to, the rationale of the biology, how much of what you need to get to where it needs to go and how long does it need to stay there is really not well thought through. And that has implications on cost of manufacturing in those activities earlier. So I'd say key differentiator companies that conduct that earlier. Also, in areas of, call it the biology or validating the biology, is not conducting enough experimentation to validate the biology earlier and to be able to do optimization in that delta, etc., so that you're more likely to get clinical or ideal clinical outcomes in first in human. Going to manufacturing as far as it relates to cell and gene therapy, I think one of the biggest implications is, the high cost of manufacturing for a single unit, certainly not off the shelf, but a one-to-one in cars or otherwise, is that patient identification is critically important. So you could have a cell and gene therapy, so the AAVs or otherwise, and if it's a rare disease population or a smaller population, are you in preclinical development creating a plan and a system to properly identify those patients? Are you mobilizing with the patient advocacy organizations and making sure that they have their genetic sequences and screenings so that you're like a fit for purpose, you're matching the therapy with that patient? We're not seeing enough of that to justify the rationale of earlier investment for a program when you know in 2 to 3 years in first in human, you're going to have difficulties. We've seen this with Spark Therapeutics. We've seen it with Carvykti. We have approved cell and gene therapy products, but they're not being dosed in areas because they can't properly identify patients and or the approvals at, the reimbursement or otherwise. I mean, the EU has many approved cell and gene therapies and have not administered a single dose in CAR T cells.
Thanks, Hilary. There's one question there from Matthew around the poison pill. It's like the shorter patent life given to small molecules. I think when Trump campaigned, he said, I'm going to get rid of the Inflation Reduction Act, and he signed an executive order to do that, I think. And from what I understand and read, but I don't think any of the action has been taken upon that yet. I don't know if anyone else has an opinion on that. Shreefal, you've answered that. I think everyone's looking at that. Obviously, it could affect our significantly, but
yeah, no, it's already affected. I'll tell you, we have a small molecule drug in one of my startup companies, and we're raising financing. And in the conversations last year, there were very clear indicators from the VCs we were speaking to. These are some of the larger VC groups that we are talking to, that they are the hurdle to invest in small molecules had gone up. And that was a very clear message that we got. And so you had to create a better package, more data, more advanced product ready to go, etc. So there will be pressure points from implementing, these MFM pricing strategies also that will come downstream all the way to the initial innovation investments that are taking place.
Thank you. So I think we've got 2 minutes left. Mahesh, you want to jump in on that?
Yeah, so I wanted to quickly touch on Dr. Rupert Holmes' question regarding the acceptable gross margin of R&D cost. When I started off, I mentioned some of the success rates that we see with a lot of these severe disease indications. And the approval timelines for a lot of these drugs is anywhere between 8 to 12 years. So you oftentimes have maybe 5 to 6 years left in recouping a lot of the money back on a drug development candidate, because about 2 to 3 years has gone into creating that in vitro early preclinical data, and the clinical data, and all of that's taken about 15 years. So you have about 5 years or so left to make and recoup the money back, which is another reason why you have to cover the cost of manufacturing, the clinical trials, and everything else. But you're also covering not just the cost of that particular drug, but all the other failed drugs as well, right? So if you have 5% success rate, 95% of them have gotten to a certain level of clinical trials, but then have failed at some point. So you have to cover and recoup all of those costs as well. So when pharma says it takes anywhere between $2.3 and $2.6 billion to make one drug, it's because they have to cover all the costs of drugs that have failed as well. So it actually doesn't cost us that much, but the failure rate is so high that it costs us pretty much whatever we need to. So I would say, from a gross margin perspective, pharma aims at about 75% of profit margin. That's kind of what they're going. And then biologics, we're often looking at 80 to 95% profit margin. That's just industry standard, because it just costs more to make that and costs more to recoup that. And generics, and this is kind of where, to Shreefal's point, it's quite low, because the profit margin there is really around 15 to 30% profit margins, what the US generic market's aiming for, whereas most of the rest of the world is actually aiming for 50 to 60% profit margin. So that's the major difference of why the price is actually lower in the US, because they're focusing so much heavily on the biologics and RX drugs and not on the generics, and that's where the change happens within the US. So I don't know if these are acceptable ones, but these are the ones that we currently have, and that's what the industry primarily goes after. So I just wanted to kind of touch upon that, because I think that's a very important point you brought up.
Thanks, Mish. I'm gonna we've come to the end of time. I want to respect the time that you guys have given, and our panelists. I want to finish on time. I want to thank all three of you, for being there and helping and supporting everything that we're doing, coming onto this panel, giving up your time. I know you're all three really, really busy, as we all are, doing stuff. Thank you for the people that have tuned in to listen to us and the great questions. And hopefully we'll see you all again soon. Thank you so much.